I am Harriet Weiner, co-chair of the Lunch and Learn program, along with Karen Rosenbaum. We are delighted to have so many people join us for an important presentation on the Guantanamo detention by Beth Jacob. Please stay muted until we go into breakout rooms, and if you haven't already done so, now's a good time to switch to speaker view. Before we start our program, we want to wish David Diskin, our Lunch and Learn technical genius, is complete and speedy recovery following his hip surgery last week. Our healing thoughts are with you, David, and thanks to Sarah for pinching in for us. To get us started today, it's my pleasure to call on Francie Schwartz, who will present a reading she has selected in keeping with today's topic. Francie?
Thank you so much, Harriet. It took me a while to find this reading by the beloved Maya Angelou. I excerpted a poem that she wrote and delivered on Bill Clinton's first inauguration. And it really, really spoke to me about all kinds of injustices that have been going on. So I don't know if it's possible to share the screen, or if it's not, I will read it. So should I begin reading, Miriam, or? Okay. It's called A Rock, a River, and a Tree. Actually, the rock cries out to us today. A rock, a river, a tree, host to species long since departed, mark the mastodon, the dinosaur, who left dry tokens of their sojourn here on our planet floor. Any broad alarm of their hastening doom is lost in the gloom of dust and ages. But today, the rock cries out to us, clearly, forcefully. Come, you may stand upon my back and face your distant destiny, but seek no haven in my shadow. I will give you no hiding place down here. You, created only a little lower than the angels, have crouched too long in the bruising darkness, have lain too long face down in ignorance. Your mouths spelling words armed for slaughter. The rock cries out today. You may stand on me, but do not hide your face. Across the wall of the world, a river sings a beautiful song. Come rest here by my side. Each of you a bordered country, delicate and strangely made proud, yet thrusting perpetually under siege. Yet today I call you to my riverside, if you will study war no more. Come, clad in peace, and I will sing the songs the Creator gave to me when I and the tree and the stones were one. Before cynicism was a bloody sear across your brow, and when you yet knew you still knew nothing, the river sings and sings on.
Okay. Thank you, Francie, as always, for your spiritual guidance. You're a wonderful teacher and you always set the right tone. We are all eager to hear Beth's presentation, but first some logistics. At the end of Beth's presentation, we will have a question and answer period moderated by Sid Booth. Please post your questions on the chat during the talk addressed to everyone so Sid can see your questions. After the Q&A session, Karen will read several questions Beth has suggested to spark conversation in the breakout room. The questions will also be posted in the chat. After the Q&A, Sarah Brown, our Zoom coordinator today, will then split the group into breakout rooms to enable us to socialize and discuss today's topic. And then at 1:25, we will regroup for brief concluding remarks. Some reminders about Zoom protocol. Please stay muted until we go to the breakout rooms so we don't interrupt Beth. It is up to you whether you wish to be seen or not. Finally, in order to prevent feedback, please do not use more than one device signed into Lunch and Learn in the same room. Now I'm happy to introduce Beth Jacob. Shortly after graduating from Yale Law School, Beth became a prosecutor in the New York City District Attorney's Office in Manhattan, where she worked for 8 years investigating and prosecuting organized crime and large-scale tax evasion, among other criminal conduct. When Beth left the District Attorney's Office, she joined a corporate law firm in New York City and spent the most of the rest of her career as a partner in corporate law firms. Much of the work was representing generic pharmaceutical companies in patent infringement litigation against brand pharmaceutical companies. Beth also defended the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the owner of the World Trade Complex, in litigation arising out of events of September 11, 2001. On a pro bono unpaid basis, Beth helped victims of that attack make claims against insurers and obtain compensation from the fund established by the US government for that purpose. That work led directly to being asked to represent men detained at Guantanamo, which she has done on a pro bono unpaid basis since 2005. In 2018, Beth left law firm practice and moved to Montgomery, Alabama, to work at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Right before the pandemic, Beth left Southern Poverty Law Center and moved to DC. She is now retired from the private practice of law, but continues to represent clients who are or were detained at Guantanamo. Beth will speak briefly about its history and statistics, about the legal rulings that have allowed it to continue, and what it is like to visit Guantanamo Bay. But today, Beth's talk will focus more on the prisoners themselves, how they survived, and the surprising blossoming of creativity and art. Beth joined Temple Micah in 2020. With one last reminder to keep muted and post your questions to Zoom chat, I am delighted to turn the floor over to Beth. Beth?
Okay, hi. First, I can't see myself. Okay. I'd like to apologize that I have a cold and a cough, but nobody can catch it since we're on Zoom. Don't worry about it. In 1 month, on January 11th, 2022, it will be 20 years since the first prisoners arrived at Guantanamo. I cannot do the entire history and ethics of Gitmo, 30 minutes or an hour. So let's do a very brief overview. I'll be skipping a lot of detail, then some of my personal experiences, and then talk about art. I'm not going to be able to get into, I think, what I had promised, how the men themselves managed to survive. I'll tell you, I don't know to some extent how some of them managed to survive as well as they have. First question, and also I should say, I'm not discussing the military commissions, which is what most people might think about. I don't represent people who are charged. I represent and have represented the men who are held there without any charges. So why Guantanamo? Why did the United States send people to Guantanamo? It was expressly to be outside the reach of any law. It was expressly so they would not be considered prisoners of war, so they would not be subject to any Geneva Conventions or other international law rules. The hope was they would not be subject to American law or constitution as well. The purpose of sending people to Guantanamo, at least to me, it's very unclear. Were they the worst of the worst? There was no real selection for most of them. It was very haphazard, very random who went and who didn't. It was part of the US reaction to 9/11, and I think it was a very emotional reaction. It was part of the dark part of that reaction, which includes the authorization of torture. And just as a side note, The two White House counsel who were instrumental in giving the legal okay to torture, there have been no consequences. One is now a federal judge and the other is a law professor. So who's at Guantanamo and how did they get there? And Sarah, first slide, please. See how this works. Okay, so there were roughly 780 detainees over the years, I think exactly 779. There are many nationalities. Ages range from children to old men. Most were probably late teens or early 20s. Many, many languages. The vast majority of them got there because they were sold for bounties. The US offered usually between $3,000 to $5,000 to some special people up to $30,000 for Arabs and Muslims to be turned over to them. There's the president of Pakistan at the time has talked about the millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars that Pakistan got by selling people for sending them to Guantanamo. Who are they? They're random Arabs, I would say, sympathizers perhaps with the Taliban, perhaps foot soldiers, perhaps missionaries, students, somebody who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, somebody who got on the wrong side of somebody who wanted to make some money. And Francie, as far as I know, no women, just men. There was, remember, a civil war in Afghanistan. The Taliban was the legitimate government, and they were fighting the Northern Alliance. So a lot of other Arabs went to Afghanistan to participate in supporting the Taliban. I analogize it in my own mind to people who went to participate in the Spanish Civil War. And therefore, many of them had no interest in the West, no interest in the US. Some of them didn't even really know what the United States or America was. Hard for us to believe, but there are people in the world for whom we are not. The United States is not the center. There are developed two different main categories of detainees, so-called, and these are government terms, high-value detainees. Those are the handful who are targeted specifically for who they are, captured by the US for specific claimed acts against the United States. They were imprisoned separately, most of them held by the CIA and tortured. There are people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is the one supposedly to, who planned the September 11th attacks. The vast majority are what the government calls non-high-value detainees and what we lawyers call low-value detainees or no-value detainees. Why are they called detainees? Because the government didn't want to use the term prisoners. They thought detainees sounded, I don't know, nicer. Who knows? In the early days, life at Guantanamo was really brutal. There was torture, constant interrogations. The men didn't know where they were, why they were there. They weren't told. One of my clients who's written some articles talks about how when they first got there, they speculated on where they were. And some of them thought they might be in India because they saw some stamps on some of the piping that said India, from India. They had no idea. They were completely isolated, no contact even with their families for the first several years. And I should say, it's not just the so-called high-value guys who were tortured. Many in CIA custody ended up as low-value detainees, and virtually everybody at Guantanamo was tortured to a greater or lesser extent. We can get into discussions about gradations of torture, but any of it, I think, is unacceptable. Their first phone calls with their families took place under the Obama administration. So that was after people had been there 6 or 7 years. At the beginning, they had no news at all, no contact with the outside world. Now, I'm skipping ahead a bit, 15 years, they actually have satellite channels, TV, but ironically, the US won't pay the subscription price to have access to US stations such as Fox or CNN. So they get their news from places like RT, the Russian government news channel. All right, so what are the bases for their detentions? Other than the allegations made when they were sold to the US, I can't talk too much about it, but a lot of it is statements made under torture, statements made under interrogation, assumptions and mistakes. And I just like to bring everybody's attention. We probably all remember the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I think we probably all remember that shortly after the attack on the airport, the US blew up a car full of, we said, explosives. And at the beginning said this was taken out by a drone strike and we had saved how many lives, this was going to be another attack. And very soon thereafter, it was learned that that was not at all the case. It was merely a car driven by an aid worker. 10 innocent people were killed, including a number of children. We are now paying reparations, and some of the explanations have been confirmation bias, that people, when they were looking at the pictures to see what it was, they saw what they expected to see. And I would say that we can see a lot of the same activity and things and analyses in some of the conclusions and explanations for the people who ended up at Guantanamo. What's the role of the courts in all this, you may ask? At the beginning, no lawyers were permitted, no challenges were permitted. This itself was challenged by some of the early lawyers who did some really spectacular work. And from about 2004 to 2008, there were a couple of cases before the Supreme Court, which ultimately established the right to lawyers and the right to bring habeas petitions. Then after that, in the next 4 or 5 years, and now we're moving into the Obama administration, guys, the DC Circuit Court stripped habeas really of most of its meanings and the ability to really challenge the detention by weakening the review of the basis of detention. And remember with the habeas, if you have a habeas case in a normal criminal case and you lose your habeas petition, you then move on to your trial, and the government has to prove that you did whatever was challenged, claimed to have done, in order to keep you in jail. And I'm not saying that the criminal justice system never makes mistakes, of course it does. But at Gitmo, there's nothing after the habeas petition. So if the rigor of a habeas review is removed, then there's basically no review at all. So where we ended up with is an extremely low burden of proof. Hearsay upon hearsay was allowed. The courts say that the integrity and accuracy of government documents would be presumed. Statements taken under interrogation, which generally means torture, are permitted. The detainee is usually not allowed to know most of the claims for the basis for his detention. He's not allowed to know the evidence or the basis for making statements. And even the lawyers are not allowed to see all the evidence. And this is only some of the complaints we, the lawyers, have. There is now a case pending before the DC Circuit arguing that some basic due process rights should apply. We've lost on this over the years, but are a little more hopeful now. And some of these due process rights are somebody should know why he's being held. Somebody should know what the evidence is against him. He should have a right to challenge the need for him to continue to be detained. And the habeas shouldn't be restricted just to what was thought at the time that he was captured and sent to Guantanamo 20 years ago, but what is the need to hold him now? The purpose of habeas, I don't know how many lawyers there are, it's called the grand writ or the great writ. And it's considered to be one of the major checks on the executive's ability to deprive somebody of liberty arbitrarily and without review. It's in the Magna Carta. But I would say in the situation of Guantanamo, the courts have absolutely and completely failed to exercise this obligation and responsibility. So anyway, where are we now? And Sarah, I guess the second slide, please. Most have been released. I guess we could do the first slide. It showed how many had been there. It doesn't matter. 532 were released by the Bush administration, mainly under international pressure from individual countries. So the West got their guys out early, the Saudis, the Kuwaitis. The Yemenis did not, and there's lots of speculation about what happened between the Yemeni government and the US government. But after all this ended, the vast majority of the people at Guantanamo, the non-high value guys, were Yemeni. And Bush himself apparently had second thoughts toward the end of his term and started jumping them out sort of indiscriminately. We, the lawyers, weren't told. If somebody was down at the base, they would send an email around saying, I just saw a cargo plane leave. Maybe there are men being sent home on it. And then we would find out that there were. When Obama came in, he set up processes and procedures. There were about 240 remaining. The first thing they did was review everybody who was there, and they concluded about half of them should be released or shouldn't have been there. But nobody was released until the middle of his second term. Obama also set up the Periodic Review Board. I'm not going to get into this in great detail, but it's pretty much like a parole board, and it has the same problems as parole boards had. You must confess and atone. And if the allegations are not true or you dispute the allegations, then you're sort of stuck. And at the end of the Obama administration, there was a strong push to go through the processes, but he left with 41 men still there, 27 of them were non-valued detainees. And now we should go to the next slide, Sarah, which is who's still there. Were these winnowed down to the worst of the worst? No. These are mainly people who had bad luck or bad timing or random chance, as I've told one of my clients, didn't make him feel any better. Somebody had to be the last to go through the PRB, this parole process. And if you were the last one, then you were going to bump into the Trump administration in terms of the ultimate outcome. So who's still there now? And it's not 40 now, it's 39, sorry. But 13 are there, although their continued detention has been determined not to be necessary. And some of them that was determined as long ago as 2010. The so-called forever prisoners, they're called forever prisoners because even though they're in the review board process, since they're not charged with anything, there's no mechanism for them to get released. If you're charged with something, you can work a plea bargain. If you're charged with something, you can get convicted and have a sentence, which will have an end, and then be released, as has happened to many, well, there aren't that many who were ever charged, but of the handful who have been convicted, most of them have been released because they served their sentences and they're gone. And then you have the 10 charged in the military commission process. And as I said, I'm not really going to talk too much about that. So who's been released since Obama? One under Trump, which was part of a plea bargain with the military commission process, and one under Biden, in accordance with arrangements made at the end of the Obama administration. There are two guys who, one of them still there, one not, who didn't get out at the end of the Obama administration because they did not finish the paperwork in time. So, okay, now stop the slide, please. Where are my clients? The first people I represented were Saudis, and they were released almost before we could meet them. So I agreed to represent two Yemenis, thought how hard could this be? And they were never charged. One was released in 2015 to his family in Saudi Arabia and the other to Oman. So I got some new clients. And when I was in private practice, we were always told you get new business by recommendations from satisfied clients. So that's how I got new Guantanamo Bay detainee clients and why I'm still doing it. So I took on two more. One was released to Serbia in 2016 and is now an author. And the other I'll talk about, I'm gonna have to go fast, I'm running out of time, who was released to Oman in 2017, right before the Trump inauguration, who's one of the artists. And then I've picked up several others. So now I represent 5 who are still there. 3 are cleared and waiting to be released if that ever happens, and 2 are still waiting for the decisions. So a little bit about my personal experiences there, and then I'd like to skip to the art, and I'm not quite sure of the timing here. So how do you get there? It's a military base in Cuba. You have to get permission from the Department of Defense, permission from the Department of Justice. There's a lot of paperwork. We have to apply way in advance. We have to pay everything. The government doesn't support any of this. We pay for our housing and our food, and we even have to pay for the military flights. And now the third slide, when you get to Guantanamo, it's like a small village, and there is a Mcdonald's. And Sarah, can you show Ronald McDonald? This is the next one. That's Ronald McDonald at Guantanamo, guys. When we meet with the guys, they're in huts or small rooms. They are chained to the floor. They're searched. It used to be fairly rough, but now they have X-ray machines. We, the lawyers, are searched, but without touching. And we're not allowed to bring in any metal. That includes a staple. I can't bring in a legal pad because legal pads, the paper is stapled to the top. There was once that my sunglasses fell apart, so I had a little paper clip holding, the glasses together, and they wouldn't let that go in because the paper clip is metal. All communications with a man who's detained are considered secret, classified, and have to be reviewed. So all notes are reviewed if they want to get out. We are watched all the time. Supposedly they don't listen, because that would be wrong, but there are very few habeas counsel who believe that. What do I wear? People have asked me that. I generally throw on a headscarf the first time I meet with somebody as a courtesy. And some of the men, when I walk in, they'll say, "You don't have to wear that, take it off." Others won't say anything, in which case I'll keep it on. And others will say, after a while, I know you don't wear that. Usually you can take it off if you want, in which case I usually leave it on. Let me move on to art at Guantanamo. So my earlier clients, the Saudis, were not artists. And even the two Yemenis I told you about, one of them, it turned out, was an artist. I didn't realize that for a while. Why would someone in that situation do art? I don't know. Some of it, I think, is artists have a compulsion to create. Some of it, I think, is when you're in that sort of situation, you have a compulsion to do something to try to improve it, or at least take some control of your life when you have absolutely no control over anything. It's an outlet, it's communication. It can give them a sense of worth. It can give them a sense of humanity. And it's creating beauty in a place of great ugliness. In the very early days, they weren't allowed to write or do anything or paint. One of the men who I now represent, I didn't then, he used tea leaves and other food to create colors so that he could paint on whatever he could paint on walls, the styrofoam cups, toilet paper. Some of them etched designs on styrofoam cups, which were seized and analyzed to see if they were secret messages. But they continued under these circumstances to try to create something. Some of them, one of my clients has said that when he was in solitary confinement, he would paint on the walls with his blood. Under Obama, things got a little better. They had classes, they were given art supplies. After a while, we, the lawyers, were allowed to bring in art supplies. There was a while when I was sending down or bringing down canvas and paints and brushes. And I will tell you, it is not easy to find brushes with no metal. Most paintbrushes have a little piece of metal, which holds the handle to the brush. But you can find them, sponges and things like that. My first experience with art was the Yemeni who's now in Oman, one of them. And he would weave baskets and rings. And actually, at that point, art was allowed out. And I still have a little ring that he made woven out of straw. Not quite sure where they got it. But my main introduction to the art was when I took over the representation of Mohammed Al-Ansi, the one who got out to Oman just days or weeks before the Trump inauguration. And when I first met him, I thought, you know, a lawyer, we're going to talk lawyer things. He had a hearing coming up. But instead, he showed up with his artwork, and we spent the whole time talking about his paintings and his art and his use of color and what he liked about it. And after a couple of meetings, he wanted to exhibit it, and I thought this would be a great thing to do. So I spoke to a cousin of mine who's an artist. She introduced me to a curator who's a professor at John Jay. And it took a long time, but after a while, John Jay did an art show, not showing some of the art as part of an advocacy or a legal conference, but just to show the art as art at John Jay in 2017. It got a lot of international attention, and as a result, artwork is no longer allowed to leave Guantanamo Bay. And the bases for this have never been quite clearly stated. But I will say that nobody has, that I've heard, has ever said there's a national security issue, and there's never been any allegations that I'm aware of that any of the art that got out, and a lot did get out before this ban, was any sort of secret message or infringed on national security at all. In fact, they now say that the men, if they're released, they cannot bring their artwork with them. And that makes no sense if it's national security, because once they're released, they can say anything they want. There's no more censorship. But back when they could get out, how do we get them out? Everything had to be reviewed. There was a whole separate process. Joint Task Force Guantanamo, the security people there who run it, they would review the artwork and stamp it, and I'll show you some of those stamps in a bit. And then it would be given to us before we left, us the lawyers, to bring out. And there were some times when I would bring a special large suitcase, so I would have room to bring more artwork out with me. If the review couldn't take place while we were still there, then the next habeas lawyer who came down very often would carry art out for me or for somebody else. I'll tell you about how I got the ship models out. but let's look at some pictures first. So Sarah, the next slide, I didn't number these slides, I'm sorry. Okay, here we go. So Sabri al-Qurashi, he's Yemeni. He was 14 years at Guantanamo without charges and transferred to Kazakhstan in 2014, which has not been a particularly successful transfer. 5 of them were sent, 1 of them died for lack of medical care. He's a very talented artist. I'm not going to show more than this, but I just thought this one was interesting. The picture on the right is one of those iconic pictures of Gitmo at the very, very early days when the men, I think that's the first group of men who arrived in January 2002, orange jumpsuits, hooded, you know, with all sensory deprivation. And then on the left is Sabri's painting of that. So the next slide is one of the ones of my client, Mohammed Al-Ansi. His name is Al-Ansi, but on this, here I call him Ansi because he said he wanted to drop the Al. He hoped to be able to get his artwork out. He thought that it would be better received if it didn't have the Al-Ansi, which sounds so Muslim. He was 14 years at Guantanamo without charges and transferred to Oman weeks before, days before the Trump inauguration. He was, I don't know, 20, I think, when he got to Guantanamo. He was young. He missed his mom. His mom missed him. This painting he calls his mother's eye. When he got to Oman, by the way, he was able to see his mom. The Omani government let her visit for, I think, some weeks. The next slide is another one of Mohammed Al-Ansi's. It's obvious what he's saying about here. The next slide is the back of one of his works. And you can see the stamp. They're approved by US forces with the date, JTF Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And every piece has that on the back. Every piece that got out anyway. The next slide, now this is Ahmed Bhatta Rabbani, who's now one of my clients. He's the one who used tea leaves and other food to make colors so he could create art, which he did before he was at Guantanamo in the very early days. He was Pakistani Rohingya. He spent 2 years being tortured by the CIA at a black site, and then was sent to Guantanamo, where he's been for the past 16 years without charges. He painted this one in response. I'm trying to remember the name of the moon. There was some years ago, supposed to be a moon that, because of the conjunction between the Earth and the moon, appeared to be very large in the sky. But his middle name, or the name he uses, Bhatta, also means moon. So you can also look at this as his comment on just the surveillance of his life, that he's always being watched and never helped. Next slide is also Bhatta Rabbani's. He has a number of paintings of like restaurant scenes. He was a chef caterer before he was captured. And in our first meeting, he told me how to cook a whole camel. And all I'll say about that is you need a very large sand pit and a lot of time. The next slide, this is one of the ship models, Muaz al-Alwi. He's still at Guantanamo, 19 years without charges. The allegations, so to speak, against him in his parole board hearing are that he was at worst a foot soldier with the Taliban, although they say they don't think he ever actually participated in any combat. And for that, he spent his entire life so far, from the age of about 22 to 42 at Guantanamo. He taught himself how to make ship models and other 3D art using found objects. This gondola he made when I agreed to represent him, and he gave it to me at our first meeting. And we don't have time, but he was explaining to me, it's made with things like bits of sponge, caps from bottles, bits from toothpaste, cardboard. And this is how he makes his models. When we see the other ship models, he takes, unravels his prayer caps and his t-shirts in order to make rigging and sails. He's a very talented painter, but I don't have any of the paintings to show you on this. So the next slide is Muaz's ship model, one of the 2 ships that got out. This is called Giant. This is the one I think somebody mentioned in the New York Times. The creation of this ship is the subject of a short documentary that's on the New York Times Op Docs. And the way we did that is that Muad and I spent a lot of time talking about art. So I gave some of my notes to the documentary filmmakers. They gave me questions. I would go down and talk to him, ask the questions. He would give me answers. The censors or reviewers would review those to make sure that there was no classified information in them, clear them, and then they were able to use that information for making the documentary. The way I got this ship out is back at the time it came out, we were flying little tiny commercial planes from Guantanamo to Florida. And there were these little tiny chartered planes. So there were very few safety rules. And that's another story entirely. But it meant I could bring the ship, which has a box that Moaz also created for it. I could bring it onto the plane with me and just like put it down in front of the seat. And for this one, I did that. I flew it to Fort Lauderdale. And then I didn't try to take it on a commercial plane because when I tried to take another one on a commercial plane, it was a problem. I ended up getting kicked off the plane, so I wasn't going to try it again. But at that point, my daughter was living in Miami Beach. So I drove it down to Miami Beach and she kept it in her tiny little studio apartment, carefully covered because she had two cats who liked nothing better but to sit on the box the ship was in. She was working with an orchestra, and finally one of the musicians in the orchestra, an Israeli clarinetist, had to drive to New Jersey and agreed to drive it up to me in the Bronx where I was living. So that's how this one managed to get out. So the next slide is another one of this. You can see the stamp approved, the ship was approved. Apparently they x-rayed it before they let it out to make sure there wasn't, I don't know what they thought he could have put in it, but they did. Muad has told me that if he had a choice between himself being released and his art being released, he would choose his art because he says he feels his life is done, but his art can live on and it's his way of communicating with the world. He says of showing his humanity, of showing detainees' appreciation of beauty, and of trying to show that the Gitmo prisoners are people, they're not the monsters they have been called. So the next slide, this is my client in Serbia, Mansour Dalfi. He spent 14 years at Guantanamo without charges and was transferred to Serbia in July of 2016, a day or two after July 4th. And he has become a writer and activist, more on that later. But this again, I think is fairly, it's not subtle in terms of what some of the messages are in the art. And then his next, another unsubtle one, is the broken hearts tied together with string. And Mansour has allowed this to be used as a logo for an organization we're trying to support current and former Guantanamo detainees and other torture survivors. So the idea of the heart being broken, but then trying to tie them back together, which is sort of what we're trying to do for the men who have gotten out and trying to hold together the men who are still there, who are often just in complete and total despair. So if you want to see more art, the next slide, there's 2 art shows coming up. One of them not so far away in Norfolk, Virginia, opening January 18th. And that's an expansion of the John Jay show. And then there's another one in Chicago, Illinois at DePaul. This is not just Guantanamo, but includes Guantanamo art. They call it Tea, Torture, and Reparations, sort of based off the Chicago law ordinance, whatever, that awards reparations to people who are victims of the police misconduct there and the police brutality there. And they're trying to analogize that to some extent to Guantanamo. And then the next slide, just a little bit of a push for Mansour's book. If you want to know what it was like to live at Guantanamo, to be a detainee there, he's the only one I know of who has written a book not only about the early days, and there are a number of memoirs about the early days, but going through until he got out, which was 2016. This is a picture of him in Serbia. He's also become an activist, in part because he's got no outlet to do anything else. The Serbs follow him all the time because he's a Gitmo terrorist. The orange scarf is his solidarity with the men who are still detained. And one of the things that I found striking about his book was he talks about how much the men supported each other, how much they were able to create communities, how much they helped each other get through the constant interrogations and just the brutality of what they were experiencing. And then just in closing, I was asked recently by a reporter, how do you think that future generations will look at Guantanamo? And what I told her was that I think they'll look at Guantanamo the way current generations, the way we look back at conduct by a country or a person that we are deeply, deeply ashamed of, and that we recognize is, and at the time was, wrong. And I don't want to equate different wrongs, I don't want to get into that, but I think it will be looked at the same way we look back now at the Japanese internment camps, the way we look back at slavery, at actions in a time when the US just lost sight of its ideals and identity and just created evil. And then questions, if there are questions. And Sid, you're muted.
Thank you, Beth, for your excellent presentation. We have all learned so much today. If you have a question for Beth, please be sure to put it in the chat addressed to everyone. Now I'd like to introduce Sid Booth, our moderator for the question and answer period. Sid?
Hi, Beth. The chat does not yet reflect much in the way of questions about the art, which is your focus. And I'd like to just step back a little bit. You're a newcomer for me and to many of us here at Temple Micah. We'd like to know, I think, a little bit more about, for example, what were the events or factors that led you to the law and then to public service, corporate law, and to this? Could you just trace that a little bit? And you mentioned a daughter. Was it family that brought you to Washington?
A different daughter. The daughter who held the ship actually is, well, I saw her little box a while ago. I think she's still here. Well, there she is waving. Hey, Miriam. Different last names so that we can hide each other. I can't really go through all my decisions. I fell into the law by mistake. I didn't want to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a historian, but my thesis advisor said there were no jobs in history, so I should become a lawyer. So I took the LSATs and here I am. Corporate law, I don't know, that's really complicated. I always did pro bono work. It was my justification for being a corporate lawyer. And one of the nice things about retirement, I guess, is you're able to do just what you want to do. Although Gitmo, I can't say, it's upsetting work and difficult work. And when I come back from Guantanamo, I'm grumpy and nasty to everybody for a while. Miriam's smiling. But the reason I picked up the Gitmo work, in part, it's sort of like doing all pro bono work, is because I believe, this is going to sound a little sanctimonious, but it's true. I sort of believe in the Bill of Rights, and I believe in the rights of the individual. The US, which falls short of its ideals, but one of its ideals is that the individual, the government is there to support the individual, and individual rights are instead. And people are not supposed to be imprisoned because of some concept of greater good. They're supposed to have rights, and they're supposed to have process and justice and all that sort of good stuff. So anyway, that's why I picked up the Guantanamo work and then just got deeper and deeper and deeper into it. In part because it's just been taking so long. When I first started doing it, most of us thought, hey, 3-4 years, we'll do the habeas. It's so obvious that these guys should be released. Didn't quite work out that way.
The sessions you have with your clients, unless you speak Arabic, I assume there's a translator. Can you describe a little bit how that goes, whether you see half a dozen people on one trip or it's one-on-one, a little bit about that climate? Okay,
well, I don't speak Arabic. I did try to learn. It's a really, really tough language, and I got almost no place. Some of the men have learned over the years, all of them have some English. All of them can understand the guards, because the guards have never from the beginning dealt with or acknowledged that people might not speak English. So all of them understand guard English, but some of them are able to really speak and do legal work and everything in English, and others not. I'd say with Mansour, who is one of my fluent English speakers, when I first met him, every other word out of his mouth was F this and F that. If you don't know what I mean by F, just ask me offline. And effing this and effing that. And I finally said, if you're able not to do that before you go to the board, it would probably be better. And he had no idea that this was improper because all he was doing was copying what the guards said. But I work with an interpreter, there's a handful of interpreters who have been doing this work for years and years and years and years. And the men now know them. And some of them are very formal and they will just interpret what we say, and others are more friendly and sort of have conversations themselves. I can only meet with one man at a time. When I go down, unless I'm going down for a particular reason, like a hearing and I don't have very much time, I try to see all of my clients at least once, because they like to meet with us, not because we're so great, but for two reasons. One is we used to be able to bring in food. So we were able to bring in, even McDonald's is good when all you're getting is military rations. And it's just a change of life. It's a different person to talk to. In the early days, we were able to give them news. We were not allowed to tell them anything that wasn't related to their case. So we would give them, news of what was going on in their home countries, because the conditions in their home countries would have something to do with the likelihood of them being able to be sent there. And I guess I shouldn't confess this publicly, but sometimes we also would tell them soccer scores. Not quite sure how soccer scores related to the likelihood of their habeas case success, but who knows? Maybe if the countries were happy that they won soccer, they'd be more likely to take people. And the meetings are half a day, morning or afternoon. And they're either 2.5 or 3.5 hours, depending on whether it's daylight savings or not, and whether it's morning or afternoon.
These prisoners or detainees, as we must say, come from, I assume, countries whose governments are somewhat repressive. How do you present yourself and gain the trust of your client, that you're not just an agent of the government?
That was really hard in the early days. When the lawyers were first coming down and the men didn't trust anybody. And it wasn't made any easier by the fact that some of the interrogators showed up and pretended to be lawyers. But after a while, and by now, the early days, people would show up, the lawyers would show up with passports. I had a colleague who was overweight, and he gained the trust of our clients because they looked at him and figured he couldn't possibly be a good military guy. Because he wasn't in good enough shape. But then after a while, as they sort of saw the legal process not work, but at least move, we did gain their trust. And by now, they know who the lawyers are, and it's less of a problem. Although some of them I still have a client who believes that we, the lawyers, are doing this because there's some benefit for us, and that we are doing it because the government feels that if they have lawyers, it will give a patina of justification to him being held, and that it's all part of a way of justifying the fact that he's still there.
Let's go to the chat. Francie Schwartz, and I'm using last names so you can meet more people in the congregation. Francie Schwartz asks, were any women in prison?
As far as I know, there were none.
David Diskin, any detainees from Al-Qaeda?
Well, at the beginning, everybody was claimed to be a member of Al-Qaeda. I'm sure some of them were. Some of them have admitted to being. Some of them, the law justifying them being held says they have to be a member of or supporter of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or associated forces. So there is alleged to be some connection. But, in terms of leadership, some of them were. Most of the ones who were accused of doing something were charged. Like Osama bin Laden's driver, charged, convicted, served sentence, released, now living with his wife and family. It's the guys who didn't have any real connections, who had no money.
Leslie Shedlin, having read Don't Forget About Us Here, why do you think Mansour's story has not gotten more traction?
I hope it has gotten more traction. I don't quite know. I think that one, people have moved on from Guantanamo. There's so many wrongs. There were the refugee crises. Part of it is there's only, and I put that in air quotes, 39 or only 27 guys held there without charges. So compared to the hundreds and hundreds, maybe it seems like not very many. I think there's a feeling that this has got to have been a winnowing process. And even if there were guys there at the beginning who didn't deserve to be there, by now, surely the men who are there, it's justified, which is just not the case. I don't understand how anything becomes, gets traction and doesn't get traction.
Leslie also asked you to talk about the limbo those who have been released are in terms of not being able to return to their families.
Some of them can return to their families, some of them can't. For example, the Yemenis aren't allowed to be sent back to Yemen by an act of Congress. The problem is, especially with the men being released under Obama and now, if any are, is they're so stigmatized. It's sort of a weird compliment to the United States that most of the world, I think, really believes that the US would not hold somebody without any cause. So if somebody was held at Guantanamo, especially for years, there must have been a reason. They must be a bad person. They must be a terrorist, whatever it means to be a terrorist. It's extremely difficult, again, to use Mansour. He was a kid, he was 18 when he was picked up. He's from some tiny little tribal village in the mountains of Yemen. And he was sent to Eastern Europe, to Serbia, to a city where different language, different culture, different everything. And he's completely stigmatized because the secret police in Serbia follow him all the time and question anybody who talks to him. It's really, really tough. Very hard. I think it's hard for anybody to make a new life involuntarily or even voluntarily. I'm sure we've all read books about people who came to the United States, wanted to come, and how difficult it was for that first generation. And it's just 10 times worse.
David Diskin, have conditions improved over the last 20 years?
Yes, definitely. Conditions, when Obama came in, and you can see this in Mansour's book very clearly, when Obama came in, he didn't quite close Guantanamo, he didn't get everybody out, but he stopped the interrogations, he stopped the torture, he stopped the solitary confinement. They were all kept in solitary confinement, although they all managed to communicate with each other remarkably. They were in communal living, they were allowed to take classes. It just became a lot better. But it was still prison, it was still isolation, it was, still Guantanamo. So it has improved. And under Trump really didn't do anything, didn't change anything. So conditions sort of stayed the same as they had been under Obama. He didn't really clamp down.
Barbara Diskin wonders if there have been any suicides.
At Guantanamo, that's a question of controversy. There have been, I think, 9 deaths at Guantanamo. There were a number who the US government said were suicides, and others claim were murders or deaths during interrogations. So that's a question of controversy. There was another one who sort of was a suicide, but there's some questions about how he was permitted to get in a position where he could kill himself. Of the people who have been released, there have been a lot of deaths. I don't know. I'm sure some have been suicides, but I don't know.
Kit Wheatley asks, what is the government's excuse for holding people without charges? How do they explain it?
I will not be fair to them. They explain it as national security. They say that this is according to the laws of war, And especially now that we're out of Afghanistan, they say that we are still at war, again, air quotes, with Al-Qaeda. And therefore, until we are no longer at war, or, there are no longer, I guess, Islamic groups who don't like us, it is fair to hold people to stop them from what they say, return to the battlefield. They haven't defined what this battlefield is. And one of the things we're arguing before the DC Circuit now is what sort of proof do they have to bring to a court to show that someone is a threat of returning to some battlefield before you can hold them? Is it just like a general thought, or do you have to talk about this specific person? I would say someone who's been there for 20 years, who's now older and has never held a smartphone, they're not much of a threat, even if they wanted to be. But anyway, that's their justification. The government has never conceded that anything it did at Guantanamo was wrong.
Peg Bleckman asks, how do you continue and not despair?
Well, I do despair, and I continue, I guess in part from inertia and in part because there's no one to take my place. At this point, there was a time when representing Guantanamo detainees was very popular among private lawyers in the pro bono bar. But not now. If I left, there would be nobody to represent these guys, and they need somebody.
How many are the lawyers are there doing this?
I don't know. There's the people who go down and visit. There's probably at this point, then there were, like when we have the DC Circuit appeal, or if there's a Supreme Court appeal, a lot of people come in with amicus briefs, supporting briefs. So it depends what you mean by this. In terms of the people who are still traveling down, there's probably, non-military commission, there's probably half a dozen or so of us who are still traveling down. But in terms of lawyers who are still representing, maybe as many as 24 who are actively representing. And then there's like an outer circle of people who have been involved and who are available to give advice and help, and also give, as I said, the supporting briefs when they're needed, and are doing a lot of the advocacy, which is important as well.
Miriam Fogel asks, do U.S. constitutional criminal laws generally apply to non-U.S. citizens, those captured overseas, and so on?
All right, so that is, again, a legal question of great contention. And there are laws. What the Supreme Court said, and what we argue, is that we don't have to quite get into that, because generally, no. Generally, the US law applies to the US. But Guantanamo Bay is, for all intents and purposes, the US. The United States controls it. There's all sorts of specifics about that. And therefore, the Supreme Court held that for Guantanamo, it was close enough to being the US that some rights, such as a habeas right, would apply to people held there. And we are litigating now whether there are additional rights that should apply to people who are there being held by the US and what is a de facto part of the United States.
Nancy Raskin, are you optimistic that the prisoners will all be released?
Well, speaking about the non-high value, not the military commission people, I don't know what I think about what's going to happen to them. The people who are in these supposed trials. But of the others, if you had asked me this about 3 months ago, I would have said yes, because I would have said I believed President Biden when he said he wanted to get them out, and that however bungled you might think the withdrawal from Afghanistan was, it at least showed that he was willing to go ahead with something he thought had to be done despite the difficulties. But now, almost a year into his administration, and one guy has been released, and that was somebody pursuant to arrangements made under Obama, who didn't get out because his paperwork wasn't finished 30 days before his release. I don't know. I'm just really afraid it's going to be like under Obama. I sort of have a hard time believing that my grandchildren will still be facing people at Guantanamo. I don't think new people will get there, and the men who are there, I hope they don't all just die of old age there, but I don't know.
Well, I'd like to combine a question from David Diskin with what's in the back of my mind. And he asks, do you think Guantanamo, it's from Barbara, do you think Guantanamo will ever be closed? And my question at the beginning of all this is, has the United States painted itself into a corner?
I don't think we have to. I mean, part of the problem is you spend so much time saying these people are so dangerous that, you know, you can't even meet with them. It's hard to say, oops, maybe not. But I also think that Guantanamo just is not very much in the public eye at this point. And again, leaving aside the military commission people, it shouldn't be so hard to release people who've been there for 15 and 20 years or whatever with no charges and will never be charged. It just, we're the United States. I can't believe that we cannot find a country or countries willing to do a favor if we wanted to call in that favor and get them released. And for the military commissions, I mean, again, it's not work that I do. I don't know the ins and outs, but I do know that the Southern District of New York has a long and storied and honorable history of successfully prosecuting terrorists and locking them up in trials that withstand constitutional scrutiny. And no reason why we can't do that. It's just a question of, I think, moral cowardice and political cowardice.
Diana Seasonwine asks, how and where can we get the book, Don't Forget Us Here?
Any bookstore. You can go to Amazon, but I'd say go to bookshop.com or go to East City Bookstore, which is my favorite, or Kramer's, or yeah.
Or the Independence. Yeah.
The Independence, go to the Independence. I'm sure Politics and Prose has it. I'm not naming all the independent bookstores, but you can also get it on Amazon, and then you can write a good review.
Alice Weinstein wonders, have any of the men married and have families?
Oh yeah, some of them are actually married who were there, but a number of them, since they've been released. Everybody in Oman, one of the things the Omani government thought was important was to make sure they had wives. So all of them are married and have families, and a number of the ones who were released not to their home countries have done it, and a lot of the ones released to their home countries did. Muslims still do arranged marriages, so I'm not going to get into the feminist politics of it, but a lot of them do have families.
John Hirschman asks, how does the Cuban government feel about this? And is it a reason to pressure, does it have a reason to pressure us to leave?
The Cuban, all right, history of Guantanamo in 30 seconds. The US opened the base in, I think, 1898. It was established with the consent of Cuba, and the treaty says that the US base stays there until both governments want it to leave. And at that point, I believe that was a protection for the Cubans. Now, of course, you know, when Castro came in, they don't want us there. At some point, the Cubans cut off water and electricity. Everything comes from the mainland now. There's desalination plants all over the place there. I don't know how the Cuban government thinks about the detention camp specifically, as opposed to just the base, which they want gone. But certainly those who want to use the detention camps as propaganda against the US, propaganda not meaning wrong or, you know, inaccurate, just as arguments against the United States.
I guess we're going to wrap up, but I want you to know that the last is not a question. Leslie Shedlin says, the book is wonderful.
It is. It's very hard going. I would not read it, especially the beginning when you're all by yourself feeling down, because Mansour begins with his first arrival there and his torture and how brutal and horrible it was. But even then, there's the glimmers of light as he starts talking about the relationships among the men. Yeah, it's a good book.
Thank you, Beth. It was good talking to you. That's a cue.
Okay, and thank you, Sid, for your always being our excellent moderator for our Q&A. And Beth has suggested some questions for our breakout group, which I will put into the chat. And right now I'll read them to you. Number one, what did you know about Guantanamo and the basis for the imprisonment of the detainees before today? And for myself, I can say not much. Two, what does the existence of Guantanamo say about the United States as a nation? And three, what do you think about the fact that the United States has withdrawn from Afghanistan, is no longer at war, and yet still maintains it can keep the Guantanamo detainees in prison without charges for life because the war on terror still exists?